In early September of 2024, an 18-year-old Australian man named Moses Thurairajasingam called 000 and falsely reported an aggravated robbery in progress. Authorities would later describe the teen as mentally ill and accuse him of purposely luring officers to his home in Melbourne, where he claimed he was being assaulted by a burglar. Upon arriving at the scene, a constable calmly approached Thurairajasingam, who pulled a 5-inch knife and stabbed the cop in a completely unprovoked fashion. The officer, who had been on the force for a year and a half, sustained a 2-inch cut to his thigh. He managed to rise to his feet and was taken to the hospital, where he underwent surgery to his wound. Meanwhile, other officers at the scene tackled Thurairajasingam to the ground. In body cam footage of the harrowing takedown, the accused attacker could be heard challenging the cops to shoot him. Just hours earlier, the young man, who is a diagnosed schizophrenic, had reportedly made similar statements to a family member. Thinking he couldn't possibly be serious, the relative dismissed the remarks as meaningless banter. In hindsight, all the signs were there. In addition to suffering from schizophrenia, Thurairajasingam had a history of depression, and in 2021 he spent 7 weeks in a psychiatric hospital. Thankfully, the police managed to handcuff and arrest the accused cop stabber without further incident. During Thurairajasingam's first court hearing, the prosecutor described the incident as a calculated attack and warned that nothing could mitigate the risk that the defendant poses to himself and others. A judge denied bail, and he remains in custody as he awaits his next court date, which is scheduled for late November. Number 16. Willis Adams. On what began as a normal day in March of 2024, police in Tallahassee, Florida, responded to a complaint about a man refusing to leave a hotel. When they arrived at the scene, officers instructed 36-year-old Willis Adams that he had to leave the property. Their body cameras captured footage of one of the cops reassuring the man that he had been refunded. For more than an hour, an officer helped Adams remove his belongings from one of the rooms and place them into his car. During that time, Adams could be heard repeatedly stating that the charges were dropped and stating his intentions to return to the hotel. The officer told him more than once that if he came back to the property, he would be arrested. He then instructed Adams to lock his vehicle, which contained his belongings, and leave. Perhaps not surprisingly, Adams returned to the property just 10 minutes later and was spotted trying to re-enter on foot by one of the responding officers. When the officer approached, Adams stated that he was on the phone with a 911 dispatcher and dared the cop to tase him. He then started to run away, prompting the officer to do just that. The taser had no effect on the fleeing suspect, who proceeded to hit the officer twice with a metal can. In the meantime, the officer tried keeping Adams at a distance by using his baton, which Adams managed to knock out of his hand. During the chaos, Adams could be heard threatening to hurt the officer. A physical altercation between the two ensued, during which Adams wrestled the officer's gun out of his hand. The gun discharged, shooting the cop in the hand, and Adams walked away with the firearm in his hand. Thankfully, the officer survived, with the expectation of making a full recovery, and Adams was charged with attempted homicide. Records show that he is no longer in custody, leaving the current status of his case unclear. Number 15. Saul Bal. 41-year-old Saul Bal has a rap sheet dating back to 2007, with much of his criminal record consisting of drug and burglary charges. He also has a history of being violent toward the police. In 2014, Bal was sentenced to 2 years in the California state prison system for trying to take an officer's gun during an altercation. Due to his status as a convicted felon, he was not allowed to legally own or possess a firearm at the time of the incident or at any point afterward. Bal's most recent run-in with law enforcement came in 2024, when officers confronted him in Phoenix, Arizona, for breaking into a car. He pulled a gun and began shooting at the cops, hitting them both. Officer Matthew Haney survived after undergoing emergency surgery, but Officer Zane Coolidge died from his injuries several days after the shooting. The incident, which constituted Bal's third criminal allegation involving violence against the police, was captured by the officer's body cameras. Despite this, Bal claimed during his first court appearance that he didn't even have a gun on him when the shooting occurred. Following Coolidge's death, the charges against the defendant were upgraded to first-degree murder. Unlike his prior court appearance, he remained silent during his hearing addressing the upgraded charge. The accused cop killer is currently awaiting trial from behind bars with bail set at $2 million. Number 14. John Liddell Jr. During the pre-dawn hours one morning in April of 2024, an officer responded to a trespassing complaint at a Quick Trip gas station in Phoenix. He was tasked with escorting an unwanted customer out of the store and told the man, later identified as 33-year-old John Liddell Jr., that he was no longer welcome on the property. As the officer walked Liddell to the exit, the suspect brandished a knife and violently attacked him. Employees sprang into action and subdued the blade-wielding assailant while the officer called for backup. Once backup arrived, they took Liddell into custody. He was hospitalized for health concerns unrelated to the incident, while the officer was treated for serious but non-life-threatening injuries, including a laceration to the neck. If the knife wounds had been just a few millimeters away, the situation would have most likely been deadly. Authorities declined to identify the officer but mentioned that he had been with the department for 6 months prior to the stabbing. After being treated at the hospital, Liddell was booked into jail on suspicion of multiple felonies. According to the most recent available updates, he was being held in custody in lieu of a $1 million bond. The outcome of the case remains to be seen. Number 13. Patricia Rodriguez. A shoplifting bust in Larimer County, Colorado took on a much more serious nature in February of 2023 when the suspect, 38-year-old Patricia Rodriguez, managed to slip out of her handcuffs while seated in the back of a squad car. The arresting officer was outside the vehicle at the time, giving Rodriguez a chance to access his gun, which had been left inside the car. She tried unsuccessfully to hold the officer hostage, and members of law enforcement from multiple agencies responded to the scene during the 2.5-hour standoff that ensued as Rodriguez barricaded herself inside the vehicle, including Fort Collins police officers, Larimer County Sheriff's deputies, the county's Hazards and Crisis Response Team, a SWAT team, crisis negotiators, and more. Rodriguez was eventually apprehended with help from a sheriff's canine and was subsequently booked into custody on 3 active warrants as well as a batch of new felony charges. She was held without bond as her cases proceeded in court, and in 2024 a jury found her guilty of 4 felonies, including kidnapping, criminal mischief, possession of a weapon by a previous offender, and motor vehicle theft. Due to the severity of her crimes and her tendency to reoffend, Rodriguez received several consecutive sentences amounting to 19 years in prison. Number 12. Melvin Butler. NYPD officers tend to have their hands full, and the afternoon of January 16, 2024 was no exception. At around 3 p.m., officers in Brooklyn's Brownsville neighborhood were called to the scene of a domestic dispute. Upon arriving at the scene, 4 officers, including Samuel Acevedo and Timothy Brennan, came into contact with 39-year-old Melvin Butler, who initially refused to let the cops into his apartment. One of the officers explained why they were there and instructed Butler to put his hands behind his back, but he remained uncooperative and instead told the police to leave, which of course they refused to do. An officer even tried to reason with Butler in a peaceful manner, telling him that the misdemeanor assault charge he was facing really wasn't a big deal, but that the situation would become a lot more serious if he resisted arrest. Still, Butler refused to relent, and instead of allowing the words of wisdom to sink in, he fought back against the cops as they attempted to take him into custody. During the struggle, he managed to wrestle Officer Brennan's gun away from him. Brennan could be heard shouting, "He's got my gun!" in body cam footage of the harrowing encounter. Butler fired 3 shots from the pistol as surrounding officers fought to subdue and disarm him. The bullets struck both Brennan and Acevedo, who thankfully survived their injuries, and Butler was taken into custody on charges of assault, robbery, and the attempted murder of a police officer. Records show that Butler is currently awaiting trial from behind bars at Rikers Island, where he's being held without bond. Number 11. Carl Wayne Buntion. Houston police officer James Irby unknowingly sealed his fate one day in 1990 when he pulled over a vehicle carrying a passenger with a lengthy rap sheet dating back more than 30 years. While Irby spoke with the driver, the passenger, Carl Wayne Buntion, exited the car and shot the policeman in the head, execution style. Buntion kept shooting even after Irby collapsed face down on the ground, firing 2 more bullets into the officer's back. He also fired several shots at bystanders while fleeing the scene and shot at a driver during an attempted carjacking, then proceeded to hold another victim at gunpoint. Buntion fired a shot at another officer before finally being captured, and in 1991 a jury convicted him of capital murder. He was sentenced to death, only to have his punishment vacated in 2009 and reinstated in 2012 after he won a new trial. Over the years, Buntion repeatedly expressed remorse for his crimes, but capital punishment remained inevitable. After exhausting all his appeals and failing to secure clemency or get his sentence commuted, Buntion's execution was scheduled for early 2022. A bout of pneumonia delayed the punishment one last time, and on April 21, the 78-year-old convicted cop killer was marched to the death chamber at the Texas State Penitentiary's Huntsville unit. Buntion gave a lengthy final statement, once again expressing remorse for his actions, but failed to fully take responsibility for Irby's death. After spending 31 years waiting for Buntion's punishment to be carried out, his execution came as a relief to the slain officers' loved ones, who were finally able to gain a slight sense of closure. Number 10. Jalil Smith. One police officer lost their life and another suffered career-ending injuries when they crossed paths with a violent man named Jalil Smith in Poughkeepsie, New York in November of 2020. Now retired Poughkeepsie officer Devin Zanin and her partner, Sergeant Edward Akin, were interacting with Smith when he stabbed Akin in the neck with a screwdriver and proceeded to assault Zanin. Akin died from his injuries while Zanin survived with wounds which forced her into an early retirement. Following his arrest, Smith spent time in a mental institution before being held in pre-trial detention at the Dutchess County Jail. When the case finally went to trial in late 2023, more than 3 years after the fatal stabbing, the jury found the now 35-year-old, who had previously served prison time on a weapon-related charge, not guilty of attempted murder. Smith was, however, found guilty of attempted aggravated assault of a police officer, second-degree assault, and criminal possession of a weapon. He received multiple concurrent sentences amounting to 20 years in prison plus credit for time served. According to state records, Smith will become eligible for parole in 2037 after serving roughly 17 and a half years behind bars. Number 9. Taiquell Woodson. On a snowy morning in February of 2024, a 33-year-old Long Island, New York man named Taiquell Woodson charged out of his front door and toward officers who were responding to his wife's call at the couple's Bayshore home. He stabbed an officer repeatedly with a large knife and had no apparent plans to stop. A taser deployed by a second officer had no effect, prompting a third officer to open fire in defense of their injured colleague. The officer survived with the expectation of a full recovery, but Woodson died from his injuries. Following an investigation, authorities determined that the officer's decision to use lethal force was justified. During a press conference, Acting Commissioner Robert Waring said that Woodson clearly intended to kill the officer. For the sake of transparency, law enforcement released body cam footage of the shocking encounter, but Waring declined to go into detail about the circumstances leading up to the 911 call that the officers responded to, leaving the incident shrouded in mystery. At about 2 a.m. on March the 11th of 2023, 2 uniformed NYPD officers were approached on the street by a broad-shouldered man. It was pouring rain on the Lower East Side of Manhattan when 26-year-old Shawndel Evans asked the on-duty cops who were posted up on Rivington Street if he could use their cell phone. At some point, the man became agitated and began striking the windows of a police cruiser. Although it wasn't immediately made clear what set Evans off, he became increasingly aggressive, punching the officers as they attempted to subdue him. As the scuffle was unfolding, a crowd of onlookers cheered the suspect on. The triumphant clamor of bystanders swelled when Evans eventually managed to free himself from the officer's grasp, as was shown in viral footage of the incident. The man pulled up his drooping pants and made a run for it, much to the delight of the crowd. One of the officers remained on the ground, clearly injured, but some of his colleagues caught up with the suspect at the corner of Rivington Street and Essex Street. He was taken into custody with a cut on his nose and blood splattered on his white shirt. Evans, a Connecticut resident, was booked into jail on charges of second and third degree assault, obstructing governmental administration, harassment, disorderly conduct, and criminal mischief. The man's mother told the New York Post that her son's behavior that night was wildly out of character, saying, "He's working, paying his bills, responsible. He's never had an issue, never been arrested. It was very sad to hear." Number 7. Lachey Whitaker and Thurairajasingam Brown. In the early hours of October the 1st of 2017, the manager of the 7-Eleven on Frankford Avenue in Philadelphia noticed a pair of women who'd been involved in an alleged shoplifting incident the previous night entered the store. 20-year-old Lachey Whitaker and Thurairajasingam Brown, aged 28, were promptly asked to leave, but they refused. As a result, they subsequently found themselves locked inside by store security while police made their way to the scene. As shown in cell phone footage, Whitaker kicked the front door as a staffer pointed pepper spray in her direction. At one point, one of the women grabbed a bottle of lighter fluid and poured it all over the store. She then threatened to burn the place down if they weren't allowed to leave. The suspect's destructive behavior wasn't done, however, as Whitaker also started tossing jugs of cleanser or automotive fluid around the floor and knocking merchandise off the shelves. Upon the arrival of a police officer, the door was unlocked. To allow him to enter, he immediately called for backup as he was confronted by Whitaker and Brown. The former tried to walk out but was pushed back in by the officer, so she lunged at him. He subsequently struck her and wrestled her to the floor. The pair exchanged blows as Brown tried to intervene, but eventually both women were subdued and taken into custody. Whitaker was charged with attempted arson, causing a catastrophe and inciting a riot. Meanwhile, Brown faced charges of assault and reckless endangerment. Whitaker's legal representation alleged that law enforcement had used unnecessary force to restrain his client at the scene. Number 6. Simone Bryna Kim. While a Frontier Airlines flight bound for Philadelphia waited to depart from the Miami International Airport on March the 21st of 2023, a heated argument erupted between two passengers on board. 24-year-old Simone Bryna Kim, reportedly from Killeen, Texas, was caught on camera berating a male passenger after the two came head-to-head in the aisle as they boarded the plane. Kim threatened to beat the man up, saying, "If you're real, show me what's up." As another woman tried to intervene, the unruly passenger continued her profane diatribe, telling the man, "You're not even from Philly." At some point, a crew member stepped in to defuse the situation, but Kim was seemingly unable or unwilling to calm down. She was asked to leave the plane, but refused. Law enforcement was subsequently called, but when Miami-Dade police officers arrived to arrest the young woman, her disorderly behavior persisted. Kim was accused of pushing and pulling officers away as they attempted to remove her from the aircraft. In a police report, it was noted that she even tried to bite and kick the cops during the struggle. She was ultimately dragged off the plane and carried like a rag doll as she was placed in the back of a police car. Kim was charged with battery on a police officer, resisting an officer with violence, assault on an officer, and trespassing. She was released from custody after posting bail. Number 5. Damian Arce, Taisha Mullen, and Cantrell James Miller. On April the 17th of 2023, the police in El Paso, Texas, had officers patrolling Gateway Boulevard West, an area known to be high in criminal activity. Officers observed a white Hyundai in the parking lot of Jaguars Club and noticed a man and a woman inside the vehicle with the cab light turned on. When the Hyundai's occupants took note of the officers, they turned off the light and started making suspicious movements, as if they were attempting to hide something. Law enforcement approached the vehicle and immediately noticed a strong smell of marijuana. They also watched the two occupants stuff something into their pockets. One of the officers ordered the man behind the wheel to step out, at which point the suspect tried to put the car in gear. The officer grabbed the man by the shoulder and attempted to remove him by force, but was unsuccessful. The suspect managed to get the vehicle in drive and accelerated, dragging the officer along the pavement before colliding with the police unit. Following the crash, a cop entered the vehicle and started punching the driver in the face to get him to stop. The man nevertheless continued driving, crashing into multiple other cars in the process. Eventually, the Hyundai came to a full stop upon slamming into a pickup truck. The officer was able to pull the motorist out of the car and place him in handcuffs. While the female passenger was being detained, another man walked up to the scene and began shouting at the police. As detailed in an arrest affidavit, the individual subsequently got into his own car and drove towards the officers at high speed. One of the policemen drew his service weapon and fired it at the oncoming vehicle. The suspect ultimately stopped short of the officers and fled the scene. At that point, the woman tried to grab the officer, who leg swept her to the ground and arrested her. The occupants of the Hyundai were identified as 29-year-old Damian Arce and Taisha Mullen, aged 27. They were both charged with assault against a public servant and resisting arrest. The third suspect's vehicle was later found abandoned. A few days later, the man, 29-year-old Cantrell James Miller, was arrested after being stopped with narcotics. He reportedly faced the charge of aggravated assault against a public servant. Number 4. Gabriel Harris. Just after 3 a.m. on November the 16th of 2014, a blue-haired man and his female companion rode bicycles into the drive-through line at Taco Bell in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. The pair stopped at the menu speaker and attempted to place an order. However, they were refused service because they weren't inside a car. The man, identified as 33-year-old Gabriel Harris, subsequently tried to enter the restaurant along with the woman, who was named as Sarah Halliburton. The pair were sent away again as the establishment had closed only minutes earlier. Harris vowed not to leave until they received the food they'd ordered, so employees called the police. After Taco Bell staff brought law enforcement up to speed on the situation, the officers approached Harris, who was back on his bicycle, and asked him to vacate the premises. When an officer tried to confiscate the red Swiss Army knife latched onto Harris's belt loop, the suspect grabbed the policeman's wrist and twisted it. The two subsequently wrestled each other to the ground and Harris was swiftly handcuffed. He sustained a scrape on his forehead during the struggle, as shown in his booking photo, which also featured the man sporting an exaggerated frown. Harris was accused of resisting arrest with violence, while Halliburton wasn't charged in connection with the incident. Number 3. Clarella Nelson Potter. The police in Cape Coral, Florida, were called to the Fathoms restaurant and bar for a disturbance in progress on the evening of January the 24th of 2023. Upon arrival, law enforcement made contact with 81-year-old Clarella Nelson Potter, who was visibly intoxicated. The woman became combative with restaurant staff and refused to cooperate with the police as they attempted to track down a relative to take her home. In a rage, Potter grabbed the cop by the back of the neck and slapped away the officer's hands as they tried to escort her away from employees. The elderly woman refused to give police her identification and became belligerent, shouting obscenities across the restaurant. As she was subsequently being handcuffed, Potter allegedly kicked an officer in the groin with full force. During the ensuing car ride to jail, she said she was going to kill someone once her cuffs were removed. She was consequently charged with disorderly conduct, 3 counts of battery of a law enforcement officer, and intimidation in the form of threatening death or serious bodily harm. Number 2. Penelope Hernandez. 29-year-old Penelope Hernandez casually walked up the front steps of the NYPD's 52nd Precinct Station House before suddenly punching an officer in the face on the night of November the 30th of 2021. The incident was captured by surveillance footage, which showed the officer exiting the station in the moments leading up to the unprovoked strike. He immediately sprung into action to detain the woman following the ambush. A struggle ensued on the sidewalk as Hernandez squirmed to free herself. However, another officer eventually came on the scene to aid his colleague, as did a male bystander who witnessed the sucker punch. Hernandez was arrested and charged with assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and obstructing government administration. The officer she struck was said to have sustained bruising and swelling to his face and an abrasion to his knee, but the injuries were in no way life-threatening. Number 1. Tawon Boyd. 21-year-old Tawon Boyd from Middle River, Maryland, dialed 911 during the early morning hours of September the 18th of 2016. Dispatchers reportedly heard the young man's girlfriend, LaToya Francis Williams, in the background. She stated that Boyd needed medical attention, but the caller himself didn't ask for medical aid. Instead, officers were sent to the residence located on Atkins Circle for what they believed was a domestic disturbance. Upon law enforcement's arrival, Boyd told them there was an intruder inside his house, which wasn't true, and appeared to be confused and paranoid. He accused his girlfriend of getting him intoxicated, while also saying he thought she was secretly recording him. In a police report, it was mentioned that Francis Williams told officers her boyfriend had been drinking and smoking marijuana, after which he started acting crazy. An ambulance was summoned and paramedics administered Boyd haloperidol, an antipsychotic drug used to calm agitated individuals. At some point, Boyd began pounding on a neighbor's front door, prompting the police to pull him away to prevent him from gaining entry. He also reportedly tried to enter several marked police cars. As his erratic behavior continued, he was ordered to lie down and put his hands behind his back. Boyd refused to comply, however, and instead started grabbing and kicking officers, allegedly injuring 3 of them. During the scuffle, one of the cops punched the suspect in the face twice, according to the police report. However, when he was finally restrained and brought to the hospital, his condition was dire. He spent the next 3 days receiving treatment before ultimately being pronounced dead. In the aftermath, Boyd's family publicly blamed Baltimore County Police and fire personnel for his death, alleging they'd used excessive force to subdue him at the scene. A few months later, around Christmas time, a medical examiner determined that Boyd's death was most likely related to drugs and officially ruled it an accident. The following year, the family filed a lawsuit against Baltimore County, seeking $10 million for wrongful death and violation of Boyd's constitutional rights. The plaintiffs relied on the testimony of other medical experts, some of whom reportedly claimed there was evidence that Boyd died of asphyxiation as a result of being severely beaten by police. In the end, the suit was settled for $1.1 million, which the family's attorney called fair and reasonable. Thanks for watching. Would you rather get in the ring with 3 cops or with Sean O'Malley? Let us know in the comments section below.